Okay, good morning, Mr. Watchik, Mr. Watchik, Mr. Nastuma, as he, and Niki Pisip, Yano Ganegaso, Nishitana Gutas. Ever Bunagak, oh, got these pieces of Minago has been at the we but jet the Saga Begik, got the we but I got these and I know hit the Bahawk, at the Benashagaski, Mr. Bugmina Shiki, the Gue Magach, any Bakanastuma to me go at you, or at Tinista. Oh, I mean, Mushkegowuk, sorry. I'm sure it's not about it. Mushkegowuk podcast got to get tick. If I'm watching Mr. Get to know me now, I'm going to mean a bit Tagus Yak. As my mean that to do to get the woman to bat to Moy, Jim to going to Hannah. Kaya, but to see her take on the static now, okay, one time is good. I say, I'm a to get take tiny sea hog and in the knock. As ski hit take him a swivel. We're going to get to chat, take on the stomach and of Tamik, watching my mistake, no me and a stomach shape. I'm in no back. Shall we make a bit the man? May got to go, you cannot stand and the Sagi Shagak. Muhaspis Nano, and the Sagi Shagak is red colored days in the hat too, and the Stuma, watching me say bit the man, and watch it to my met in the Makokanigi. Kagi Nusunat Hagan took me what we say talk about this in Sunat stand up at the Suno and the Sagis cannot stand on him Hogi on Egishagatic, we're going to go take a Sagishaga. This Tamago, Wabba Hegisha Bagget, with that Spanigate, our Grand Chief, Tayamo, Mushkegowuk Grand Chief, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Okay, without further ado, we're going to introduce KBTM Hetak, Kidu Temino. Tegi Dotio. Mr. Mokuana Ski Shiki Dotio, it did the bad Takivana, and with the statue of Istino, Utabat the Zone Teke Shagomaga. We but the bait in the soup, and the Tuma and of Tomago Chiki back. Okay, good morning, Mr. Fleming.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm good yourself. Thank you very much for your accepting the invitation to speak to us on our podcast show from the Mushkegowuk territory.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. I feel like some celebrity now coming on the podcast.
Oh, yeah, you'll get there. You're going to get promoted yet.
Well, it's all this work that I'm doing is not just me. It's obviously for our people. So I got to lift them up in everything that I do.
Yes, that's for sure. And that's really awesome to know that the work you guys have been doing with the other fellow friends and colleagues, like we got Geronimo, we got Ramon, and then sorry to forget the other guy you were with when you guys went to the UN place. So in terms of that,
Cohen.
Yeah, Cohen, exactly. So in terms of that, maybe perhaps you can introduce yourself, let us know who you are. And who your parents, I'm sure a lot of people would like to know. Actually, a lot of people did ask me, who is that guy you're talking to? So, and I said, well, listen to the show, then you guys will know. So take it.
Yeah, no, thanks for giving me the opportunity. Because I was born and raised Moose Factory of Moose Free First Nation. So I was born there, and then we left community, I think, when I was about 11 years old. We stayed in Mushkegowuk territory. We moved to Cochrane, Ontario. And then I completed high school there, and then I continued to move south for my education. But my parents are Deborah and Mark Fleming. So Fleming is in our actual native name. So we're Chicazans, so we come from the Chicazan clan. The name change is not a story for me to tell. Obviously, that's a part of my dad's history. But my grandparents were Mary Chicazan, so Mary Spence, and Joe or Joey Chicazan. So they had eight kids, including my dad. So they were Albert, Simon, Joey, Janet, David, and Stanley. So at the moment, only my dad Mark and my aunt Janet remain. So they were all scooped up during the 60s over in Moosonee, and all of them were either separated or moved together across Northern Ontario during the 60s. A couple of them obviously didn't survive the 60 scoop. My uncle Joey ended up being homeless on the streets of Toronto back when I was a child, where he unfortunately passed as well. But Mary and Joe also were residential school survivors. So obviously our family line has been touched by these major historic Canadian events that have altered, obviously, our people's success and lifelines in such a way. So all of that, having the privilege of being born in community, I carry all that with me everywhere that I go now. All the work that I do. But I think an important part of this story as well is that is the part where my dad was able to make it back up to community, because I said that they were all scooped up during the 60s and moved around Northern Ontario. So he just by chance as well was offered an opportunity while he was in Cochrane as a young man. After kind of being, how do I want to frame it? It's hard to imagine just the experiences of a child, of a young person going through not just residential schools, as my grandparents have, but as their children during the 60s scoop. I only hear stories and reflections and of my family that is no longer here, and obviously of those that are still living. So it's hard to imagine, but one could piece together how difficult it would be to return to community after getting scooped up and moved south. You have very little resource. You have probably no money to your name, especially when you're in foster care. You're kind of at the control of the foster families. I can't remember the number that my dad was tossed around, and it was definitely somewhere upwards of 10 or 15 homes. And he likes to detail there were some good ones there, but the majority were bad, and obviously he lost siblings in some of these homes as well. But with all that context in mind, you can imagine how difficult, as I said, it is to get back to community. So he was fortunately bridged an opportunity to get into Native policing. I guess Canada at the time was starting to implement a Native policing program in its infancy. And so he was offered an opportunity to get into a program such as that, which ends up being his trajectory back up into Mushkegowuk territory. So him and my mom being Deborah Morehouse at the time, before they got married, she was also teaching up and down the coast, from Peawanuck, Moose Factory, Attawapiskat, where she on her own as well had the opportunity to get very close with the Mushkegowuk territory, all of our elders. And she ended up eventually working at Monistic School as a principal there, where then we started our family. So I'm the first of 4 children, so the oldest. So I was able to, I guess, live the longest up there within community, to be fortunately intertwined with a lot of our teachings and culture, which outside of community, especially if you move further south, becomes a lot more limited the further south that you go. It's a blessing, and I think a little bit of a curse with the context in which our First Nations now live in Canada, especially our remote nations, where we have the ability to remain connected to the land up there in such a way that First Nations in the southern parts of what we now know as Canada are not so. They're more intertwined with our metropolitan centers. So that's why I say it was a privilege for us to be raised within community, because now I carry all of those teachings from the land and our elders, my two Zipim and Musham, so Jean and Charlie Morrison, who are not blood relatives to me, but they took the role on as grandparents for when I was being raised on the island. So Mary and Joe at that point also were further south. Joe ended up in Toronto also. Mary was around Timmins, Cochrane area, but we were, because of their own trajectories, the 60 scoop, the residential school, surviving the residential schools, obviously all of that had fractured this Chicazan family in such a way. So we weren't that close with them. We were around each other, but the family by that point was so fractured. So I was fortunate enough on the island to be taken in by the Morrisons, who are now both passed. But that is just a little bit of the history of who my family is. Like we still have property up in Cochrane now. My parents both reside in Ottawa, taking care of one another. All of the siblings are out on our own now, so the house is a little bit empty. I now reside in Toronto here, where my life has unfolded in such a way, kind of like my dad's reconnection back to community, where opportunities have presented themselves in such a way. And I see this as a creator giving me a larger purpose to be able to do whatever I can with what capacity that I have built to be able to help my people in any way that I can. And so this is why my educational journey is now down this pretty long path, where it was never a plan to get into my PhD or anything like that. But the longer I have studied now, the more fruit I am able to provide in terms of capacity to my registered home nation, Attawapiskat, and obviously the broader Mushkegowuk territory now. And obviously we're seeing it right in action with the coalition building that we have with, between the institutions that I'm involved in and our grassroots youth organizations, the Pinuak, and Here We Stand with the Cataquapics and so on. And so that's just a little bit. And obviously, it's a very large story. I could probably go on for hours. But that's a little bit there.
Oh, yes. That's very informational. And now we all know where you come from, your roots.
Those roots are still strong. Man.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Thanks again for that. So also, you just attended the United Nations recently.
Mm-hmm.
And you delivered an intervention on Indigenous issues like climate, like shortfall on funding for First Nations. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah. So I think since coming back from the UN, I've taken a little bit of time to ground myself again, because it's one thing to carry with you the responsibilities of like your people, of Treaty 9, and obviously all the weight that could put on one person. So obviously I'm so grateful to have been able to carry our responsibilities as a young delegation to the UN in the U.S., New York City. But since returning, I've just been taking time to sit with that responsibility. I've been offering it a little bit of tobacco, reconnecting with ceremony, and sitting with what was carried there and what ultimately has come back with us. Because that work didn't essentially start at the UN, obviously. And it also doesn't end with just that attendance. It comes from here, from our territory, and from our people, and then from our responsibilities that we carry under Treaty 9. But when I went to the UN, so the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, I personally didn't go there as an individual, as I was saying. We went as a part of a delegation. So we were grounded in our community, in our family, in our leadership, which we made constant contact throughout the entire time, because we're not going there to speak for ourselves. We didn't go there to represent just us. This wasn't like some fun vacation. This was all with purpose. At the UN, I think it's important to just get a little bit of a preview of what those platforms, especially the Permanent Forum, actually are. So there are 3 Indigenous forums or mechanisms at the UN that Indigenous peoples around the globe are able to engage with. The first is the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where we're, as people, able to bring forward political, social, economic, and governance realities directly to the UN system. Now, outside of that, there's also the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So that mechanism develops the legal and policy guidance on Indigenous rights and implementation. And then the third mechanism within this platform is the Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So that individual investigates violation and holds states, including member states, to the UN accountable internationally. So they're not just symbolic spaces. They should be seen as tools to leverage. So the Permanent Forum essentially gives us the visibility, and the expert mechanism shapes the legal interpretation and the standards. And then the Special Rapporteur creates pressure and accountability. So together, they allow us to take issues from Treaty 9 and place them within international human rights law. So because what are in our territory, the Treaty 9, and even more specific, our Mushkegowuk territory, is not just some domestic issue. It's a human rights issue, and that's what I was bringing forward in some of my interventions. So we spoke as a delegation, but me specifically as well. I spoke directly to the gap between commitments that Canada makes on the international stage, the narrative it tells about itself, so that we are, as a nation, working in collaboration with our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, our Indigenous peoples, in however the many ways that they framed it. Now, I've also spoke to the gaps in implementation, and that is one of the largest issues, not just across Canada with any treaty or any commitment, but this is also a common through line felt around the globe as well. So what was important in some of these interventions as well was, and what has been helpful is obviously my study. Like I study Treaty 9, I study political science more broadly, so I understand governance systems, Indigenous governance, our actual federal system and provincial systems within Canada, So I'm very intimately familiar with all this. So I was able to, within my interventions, speak the language that they would best understand. And that's how, in a lot of the work that I do, that's exactly what I aim to do. I'm aiming, and the purpose of my work is to carry forward all of our knowledge systems, all of our teachings, all of our laws, our governance systems as we know them, and translate them into language that Canada, or more broadly, any colonial system or international system understands, and vice versa as well. So I see myself kind of serving as like a conduit, a bridge between these various levels, community, the federal, provincial space, and the international space. So I could transmit knowledge and like carry those responsibilities back and forth so we could get a better understanding to all of our individual needs, and in hope that we could properly address these gaps. But we were also in an intervention, like we wanted to speak to the pressures on our lands as well, and our waters, as now it's being framed as economic reconciliation. Like that's some now new term, a new, almost like you can kind of see that as a new adage. Because the conversation around reconciliation is obviously not new. But I continue to document that was created in the 90s in response to the Oka crisis, RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So that was one of the most comprehensive and costly studies and projects that produced real, tangible results and pathways toward reconciliation. And one of the most important pathways within that document was renewing the treaty relationship. And so that's where I ground all of my work, because as people, especially in Treaty 9, we don't want to let go of treaty. And growing up, it's hard to kind of understand why that is. Because we look at the realities on the ground of that our communities face every day. Like in the Mushkegowuk territory in Attawapskat, we and just around the James Bay, Hudson Bay lowlands more broadly, it's crippled with conditions of poverty. And so growing up, you normalize that. We've got the land. We don't need much. However, it's like why are we not moving forward as a people, as community, as a territory, as a broader Treaty 9 nation? Why are we so stuck in these crippling conditions? When you just hop on the train from Moosonee to Cochrane, and you're out of community, and you go into the broader non-Indigenous world, let's say, it's different. The conditions, sure, there's conditions of poverty across Canada, but the conditions under which our communities as First Nations face are just starkly different. Like, why do some of our communities have little to no access to potable or drinking water? Like, why is that an issue? Why are our communities always being evacuated? And being placed up into temporary homes or shelters across the province? Like Cash is one that I had explicitly referenced in my interventions. That's just a singular example of many. They're spread out across Ontario, because they're the issue with their filtration and water systems up there to be resolved in a to be determined date. I think the last I saw, it was proposed maybe the project would be finished in August, like give or take, if that actually happens. So always being forced to relocate, disconnected from the land. Like, why do we have to face these things? And so now we're seeing this economic reconciliation strategy. We've moved so far away from the renewing the treaty relationship now. So it's almost like conversations around treaty are no longer present. You don't hear the federal government talking about renewing treaty or renewing the relationship. You do hear them talking about relationship, but now it's framed in an economic way. And so how does that benefit our communities? Well, it's important to understand what they mean by economic reconciliation. Like the only reason, or let's say the main reason, is now we have global pressures. Like obviously now our communities are having to deal with the realities of what is happening around the globe. Obviously not a new issue either. But now there's extra pressure placed on our territory. The Ring of Fire is now a new hot conversation. Obviously it's not new in terms of resource development. The governments have always had their eyes on it, but now more so. It's accelerated. You've got Bill 5 in Ontario, Bill C5 in Canada. So it was important to bring these realities around what is actually happening on the ground here in Canada and our treaty territory. We're moving so far from what reconciliation actually means, and now we're placing the financial risk and burden on our communities with most of what is being proposed now by these other levels of government framed as economic reconciliation. So we've got lots of interest-free loan programs to help nations fund their own projects, but those are loans. Like they still place the risk on our First Nations, not on the Crown. So essentially, all that has happened is a reframing of, oh, look, you can make money off these projects in your territory. There's law, and we'll partner with you in that, in whatever financial fruit you'll get from that. However, what they also fail to mention is, well, what happens if the project doesn't pan out? What are the longer-term risks and implications, let alone to the land in these remote First Nations? And so it was important to bring those realities up and also just add in one of the interventions I did as well, was the reality of what, to at least ensure that the same old strategy that Canada, but more specifically Ontario also being a partner to Treaty 9, a signatory, the strategies that they have historically used against our people in Treaty 9 is to divide and conquer. So that's why you see because we're such a large treaty territory, but we're all so different. We all have different needs, we all have different realities, but the histories are pretty intimately similar. And so what you see now in this framing of economic reconciliation is Ontario going and making piecemeal, temporary, short-term deals with First Nations in our treaty territory, specifically to create a bridge, a road, exactly, to the Ring of Fire. Obviously, with granting access to some of our remote communities, there's tons of positive that comes with that. But the underlying goal of some of this access to the Ring of Fire, by connecting our communities by road, is so that government has access to the Ring of Fire. So I sit here questioning, like, well, unfortunately, I see this strategy being repackaged and repurposed and just recycled again in a different generation. And I can't help but get a little bit frustrated because these levels of government are taking advantage of the conditions of poverty that they have created, be that through residential schools, the Indian Act, like insert the list of major historic events that were meant to solve the Indian problem in Canada. So now that was really the foundation of a lot of our interventions, was to carry not just the responsibilities to Treaty 9 specifically, but the responsibilities that we have to our people to protect them, to inform them, and to also champion their aspirations and their realities right on the global stage, so we could challenge Canada face to face, which we did, and ensure that we offer a contrasting reality, a contrasting narrative in these spaces in which they are members, in which they champion a different narrative, that they are so pro-reconciliation. It's so great here on the ground. Look at all that we are doing, but the implementation gaps remain, and obviously with that create the structural conditions under which our territories are suffering.
Yes, good, for sure. That's really a good statement. In terms of that, it sounds like it's a vision of your guys'. You guys have a good vision, like to bring into existence, like to look forward to what you guys are doing. Like it's like taking on a mission. So what's your next step? What are you going to do from here on?
Well, so at this point, so when Bill 5 and Bill C5 were introduced almost a year now, it's been about a year. Our grassroots had mobilized, like Geronimo and Ramon, Cohen also, and so on. Our youth were mobilizing all over Ontario. I'm obviously in the big metro center of Toronto now, so it has given me a perspective down here of what the broader non-native population, or at least the southern communities, are fed by government. All that we're fed down here is propaganda, like the Ontario, the Ford government, since last year has been just inundating the population with ads, radio ads, TV ads, all about the Ring of Fire, and how just generating consent from the broader population about why development in the Ring of Fire and that territory is good. Even going as far as to almost pull on the people's heartstrings. They're saying that the minerals will be used for hospitals, all this equipment, but no mention of our people. No mention of the First Nations up that occupy our territory up there. And so over the last year, obviously much of our work is intertwined with my study. Like I'm on a path right now where I think it is important to do everything that I can. Attawapiskat has been gracious to support and fund my entire educational journey. And I see that also as a responsibility to make wise with that funding. Nothing that I do, and nothing that our other delegates as well have done so far, is out of a self-serving purpose. We all have a common goal. It's to ensure that we, in any way that we can with our capacity, that we are building or have built and continue to see to fruition, however that may turn out for each individual, that we utilize that to help our people, to fight against the historic and ongoing injustices faced by our communities on the ground. Because being a remote community, especially in Mushkegowuk territory, it's out of sight, out of mind. Like, and you see that you hear that framing as you learn about the reserve system and the Indian Act as well. like these plots of land created out of sight, out of mind, like to control, almost like you're putting our people in a little cage, a little pen, like a bunch of animals, so you can control them, watch where they're going. Obviously, I don't need to go into a long history about that, but with being out of sight, out of mind, our issues are not on the forefront. We are not privileged in such a way where we're other First Nations across Canada getting tons of attention for whatever reason that may be. And so our communities have had to resort to extreme measures. In some cases, like our women, which I had brought up in our interventions as well, like in Ottawapiskat, my aunt, Chief Teresa Spence, back during her hunger strikes, like during I Don't Know More. Like, was that necessary to call attention to our people and the disparities we live under, the injustice? And that was repeated again with her and our now current chief, Sylvia Kostajin-Matadawabis. Also took up a hunger strike a couple of years back as well to draw attention again to more disparities. And so we look now to support leadership. We look to support our home communities in any way that we can. Indigenous diplomacy at the international level is just one pathway that us as a collective, as a delegation, and as individuals see as fruitful and important to ensure that we occupy that space as well. Now, our grassroots have obviously mobilized on the ground, and they will continue to do so. I know Geronimo and his family and the coalitions that he's built amongst our people and neighboring nations up there, they're going back on the land this summer again to champion Here We Stand on the river as well. Because what is abundantly clear is that we're entering we're entering a new phase of this battle now. And it's obviously bound to get there's more tension building. And that's the warning that we gave Canada on the international stage, that conflict is not necessary. These extreme measures that our peoples have to take are not necessary. And so with this work and this battle to seek justice, to get Canada and Ontario to honor treaty, is entering a very difficult phase. At this point, Ontario's Bill 5, as we have figured out now, is not the only danger, but it kind of serves as more of a signal. The protections have already been rolled back, been weakened in Ontario, and what is being presented, I think, more publicly now is just part of a broader restructuring of various environmental protections, consultation, and decision-making authority across our treaty territory in Ontario more broadly. Quietly has Ontario rolled back these protections, and it's almost like Ontario has now used Bill 5 as kind of like a smokescreen. I want to frame it as, because they have not yet invoked it for our treaty territory. And why is that? They've been threatening to invoke it. It seems like it was created for that purpose, and with how hard they're going on the Ring of Fire, that to create these short-term agreements to make it look like First Nations consent to the development there, parading out some of our brothers and sisters in leadership across our territory to the public eye, like, look, we're working together. But but why not just invoke Bill 5? And so I think at this point, this is part of a broader dangerous strategy where at this point, I don't think that Bill 5 for the Ring of Fire is going to be invoked because all of the laws that Bill 5 was created to supersede or for the government to become exempt from have already been rolled back. The heritage protections, the burial site protections, like all of that is already rolled back now, and they've been doing it quietly, one by one. But you don't hear about this obviously in the news. And so now it's moving into a dangerous territory. So they're going back on the land. I'm now working within leveraging the institutions. I have great connections now out of the University of Toronto. I've now moved into a phase where I'm able to help disseminate knowledge and carry that responsibility to our communities to help them become exactly informed with the pathways available for us forward, to defend treaty, to also highlight pathways forward that they could explore with how to fill these implementation gaps and to address the injustice. Because at the end of the day, our delegation also and us as individuals are not here to dictate what any nation is going to do. We're not here, of course, we're children of Mushkegowuk territory and Mushkegowuk Cree peoples more broadly, but we're not leadership. We're not speaking for our nations. What we did and what we will continue to do moving forward is carry the responsibilities, carry the direction of our leadership, because we're in close collaboration with all of our leadership, from our First Nations to our tribal councils to our broader political organizations, all supporting us in different ways. So we are always speaking our leadership at those levels, specifically at our nation level. We're just serving as a conduit, as I was with those various different levels. We're carrying their needs, their realities, and their wants to these spaces. So that work continues through my research as well, and the work that I'm doing, the diplomacy that I'm doing, the coalitions that we are building together. So this work just continues. Like this summer, I'll be going to the United Nations in Geneva as well to intervene at the expert mechanism for the rights of Indigenous peoples there. I am privileged also in that Creator has connected the paths of myself and Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot, who is now my supervisor here at the University of Toronto, but she serves as the vice chair of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So she's also a First Nations person from the U.S. side, but now has been living in Canada for quite some time. And so we are able to bridge these partnerships from community right up to the international level with all the relationships that we have been able to build and the coalitions that we are still strengthening along the way. So we are mapping a plan forward. We're to have a meeting also with our Attawabsket leadership very soon, now that we're all returned, to meet with our current and some of our past leadership to discuss strategies forward, what other mechanisms we're able to leverage. I also work very closely with some of our other Treaty 9 First Nations over on the northwest side as well. And so there's a lot of relationships being built and a lot of work being done behind the scenes. And so at this point, I'm continuing to build those relationships and disseminate all this knowledge.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you for that, Ryan. That's a lot of information for a lot of us to actually listen, like in terms of to listen and understand what happening to our people. Like we all know, everybody knows, like the whole world knows, like we're mistreated. There's so much things that are underfunded, just like he said, and everything is just changes. Everything is changing for the future. Like so I always wonder, what's our mission? What's our vision in terms of that for the future? What are we looking at? What are we going to do for the future? How are we going to establish or set up something for our young generations? We might have heard past leaders, everybody for the last 30, 40 years, every meeting that's been on, off, every meeting we had, and for our First Nations people. And when you think about all the stuff that's what's been happening since then and today, we're still talking what we're going to do for future. Like we're still underfunded. Like we're still fighting for a lot of things with our treaty rights, inherent rights. Just like we said, like, now what's going to be like, when are we going to actually come together and say, this is it, that's it, and this is what we want, stuff like that. Is there actually something in place? Do you know? Like, can you correct me if I'm wrong? But your statement is like, for mine, it opens a lot of things that I envisioned for the longest time, like being in communications, sitting with the chiefs for the last, I would say, 30 years as a technician. And when I hear 30 years ago, it got worse. I find it got worse than what it was 30 years ago with our grandparents, their vision. And every person, like 40 years ago, I heard my grandfather itself, the late Emil Nakogee. He always said, every time I used to go see him, every day he always visions himself, future is not going to be what it is today. The future will never be the same as it is back in the day. And he always told me, a lot of people might want to go back what we did, and he told me, don't do that. Go forward, move forward. And I believe that. I hear a lot of people say, I want to go back to my traditional ways. Their traditional ways were different compared to, like, in an in-house, like in terms of, like, I would say, an urbanized traditional ways are different compared to a northern bush life. I find that way different. His stories he told were just like same visions as your grandparents heard. They were there, and it's happening to us today. And I can just imagine what's going to happen to our future generations, our kids, grandkids, their kids. That's why I say today I think it's time. It's our time to, to put in writing, no, this is it. It's time.
Yeah, no, what you're speaking everything that obviously what we all know as a people. We hear this. It's another generation kind of championing the same aspirations, the same, like, things can and should be different. And so that's kind of where much of the foundation of and the motivation that has come in just my work as an individual as well is I wanted to understand how and why the structural conditions under which our communities currently live day to day. Why is that? Once I understood why and how those conditions came to be, I think that is one piece that is not very well known. Even though we've moved forward with our non-Native brothers and sisters as well. Like since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all the calls to action, the discovery of potential unmarked graves over the last several years, that has forced a reflection for folks in Canada as well. Now, what was to come of that reflection? What was to come of that new information, that new reality that we have all lived with as peoples for generations now? What was the broader population in Canada supposed to do with that information? What eventually I think has happened now is, as time moves forward, broader populations have looked to the government to, well, you guys need to do something. Like, what is this truth and reconciliation? Like, what are the solutions to, if we now know that the conditions under which First Nations now live, the systems as they have now evolved to be, and how First Nations are governed in Canada, not similarly to the rest of folks living in Canada, but in this very unique, different way. What do we do with this information and this reality now? And as time has moved on, obviously people look at dollar figures. And obviously, we are all very intimately familiar with a lot of racist tropes that our peoples have faced over generations. One just being that the federal government seems to just be throwing money at nations with no real tangible result, no difference in the conditions under which we all live. And I understand that frustration because, that is not solving the problem. Like, what will solve the problem is reconciling with the truth. So the truth in the Truth and Reconciliation, that's the truth part. Recognizing and following what our colonial legal system here in Canada continues to affirm. Since way back in the 70s, since the patriation of the Constitution and so on, and the entrenchment of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. What that has done now is transformed our political and social claims that we have been fighting and presenting on the national stage. They transformed those into now constitutional and legal claims. And so since then, you have big Supreme Court cases, Delgamuuk, so on, up until the most recently, there's Cowichan out in BC, all of which have continued to affirm Indigenous authority in different ways. It's moving towards self-government. It has affirmed Aboriginal title. Like, all of this in the colonial legal system has becoming clearer and clearer. And that is kind of part of my study as well, where it's like, look at how, now studying political science, I look at like both our governance and legal systems, our policy frameworks, it's all tied together. And I look at that from our Indigenous perspective, broadly across Canada, but just as a Mushkegowuk Cree from Ottawa, Muskegowuk, born in Moose Factory, from Mushkegowuk territory, me being frustrated with the structural conditions, that obviously that frustration is shared amongst all of our people. And then seeing that, oh, look, actually, what is happening is that our authority is not imagined. What we champion and what our ancestors orally agreed to, in Treaty 9 specifically, it carries real legal weight. Treaty in Canada, our historic treaties, and our now more modern land claims, now known as modern treaties, those hold constitutional weight, as affirmed by the colonial legal system in Canada now as well. They make up the constitutional fabric of Canada. as a founding partner amongst the British, French, and Indigenous peoples in Canada. And that has continued to be affirmed by the Prime Minister at the moment. He likes to say that. And I don't think truly, maybe he understands the weight that carries, but it carries legal weight. And so our institutions in Canada, the federal government, our provincial governments, their institutions have not yet caught up to the colonial legal system. And that's usually the opposite. So when the courts in Canada affirm something, they make a decision, the institutions in Canada, the governments, are quick to adapt to that legal decision. And so what we see happening is, but because this is an Indigenous issue, we're actually going to pretend to ignore these decisions. Or at best, we're going to try and adapt the current foundation of our systems that have been built to exclude our people's authority. We're going to somehow create policy within them that will somehow include them, but just enough that they don't have enough jurisdiction or enough authority. And so I sit here now in my study and I look at, as we move forward as people that occupy the land now known as Canada, and as Indigenous peoples here that have been here since time before time, how does one reconcile that system without at some point it chipping away at the legitimacy of the Canadian state and its legal system? How long can Canada ignore what its own courts are continuing to affirm year after year? And so I kind of had said at the outset that I am privileged in that I've been able to get a perspective of the inside out. I've worked in a couple different capacities with the federal government as well, be that in Indigenous services, Crown Indigenous relations, public safety, and so on, alongside my studies. And so while actually being inside the government to see how they operate, I've seen in real time up until present that their systems can't accommodate that authority. And in real time, they are trying to figure out how to do so. Because the institutions that we have now in Canada were, like I said, built to exclude Indigenous peoples, to exclude our authority. So they were never built for our inclusion. And what now happens, like I had wrote a paper that I'm putting forward for publishing over this last year. It speaks to exactly this, I call it coordination without consent, where governments are efficient at coordinating together. So federal and provincial governments. However, they exclude the consent and inclusion of not just the other signatory to Treaty 9, Indigenous nations, that across Canada more broadly, that how they now operate their systems while continuing to exclude and ignore that authority. And so what happens now, I obviously want to take on all of this information, and I see it very important to be able to translate much of what our peoples have been saying, as you were mentioning, like things can and should be different. In our generation or the next, things will be different. Just changing the conditions on the ground so we are just living at least at an equal level as everybody else in Canada. Equal as in just the bare minimum. Just please give and restore the rights, let alone our inherent rights, just our basic human rights, to access to clean water, access to food that doesn't cost an arm and a leg, that our people have to rely on just processed foods up in the north, because that is at least cheaper than fresh produce or meats that are not like $40-50 for like 5 legs of chicken. So I see the importance of getting into these spaces of influence, these spaces of decision making, and influencing them myself by bringing forward my community and our treaty territory and any other nations that are willing to partner and coalition with us right to the source, and hold them accountable in the best ways that we can. But that also requires coming to the table with solutions, with pathways set out. And that has always been the missing piece, that our communities have aspirations, but in most cases, we don't have like a real thought out plan about like, how do we get from point A to point B? And for much time, obviously, that our communities have just been trying to catch up because of the historic events that our communities have lived through and continue to try and move past. I had framed my home community, Attawapiskat, and this is the same for Moose Factory. I had the same when I went up and visited in February. I use the same phrase where it feels like it's frozen in time, and that kind of is good and bad. It's good in that, wow, this feels exactly how I left it. Like my people, the relationships, my friends, the people that were able to welcome me back up there with open arms because we had established those relationships. The land, it still looks the same. It's pristine. It's untouched. But the other side of that, too, was frozen in time also means those conditions that we live under are frozen in time, that they have not yet changed. And so what I have been doing since my master's has been exploring pathways with other scholars through the University of Toronto and scholars and practitioners in these international arenas as well, because it's not just a venue, the UN is not just a venue to go and to voice things. As I kind of said earlier, they're tools. They can be used and leveraged in very specific ways. So what I've been doing is charting pathways, different pathways, because each nation is going to want something different. Maybe something is not suitable for them. Exploring different pathways to get out of the conditions that we are living under and to get to a place that nations and leadership see themselves in the future. But in order to get to that future, we need to act now. And so I am at service to not just my community of Attawapiskat, but the community of Moose Factory, Moose Creek First Nation, which I was born in, my broader treaty territory, however nations, leadership see benefit in the skills and capacity that I have amassed, the knowledge that I have been able to amass and share. Use it however you will. And this is what is required. And this is kind of something that much of our leadership has also said about just our treaty territory as well. We're vast, we're large, and we're diverse. In order to champion our jurisdiction appropriately and effectively, it requires us all to work together. And so that has been difficult for our nations. But it has obviously gave birth to our different political organizations over time. But fractures still remain, and understandably so. We have different realities. We have different needs. And so that is what I am doing now, is to chart pathways in collaboration with some of our nations Because that's kind of what I had mentioned earlier, like meeting with my leadership, meeting with leadership across our treaty territory, because everyone at this point is seeing the same thing. Something needs to be done. And ultimately, it's now or never, because we have the ring of fire and all eyes are on it, and nothing is going to get their eyes off of it. If we are as connected to the land as we say we are, and our people and our leadership at different points have put their bodies on the line, and even affirmed at the United Nations as well, the UN Indigenous Determinants of Health, that outline and affirm our well-being and health is tied to the land and water in which we as people are connected to. You can't separate both. So if all of that is true, we need to act. We need to be working together to present solutions, to chart our own pathway forward. And that is kind of what I had mentioned in my master's thesis, is I kind of framed it as Indigenous-led reconciliation. Because the work of reconciliation has more often than not been kind of work that non-Native folks need to do as a population. And in part, that's true. That in a relationship, in treaty, they're partners. We all need to uphold the obligations, the promises, and the responsibilities that come with that. And us as people have always held up our part, and we'll continue to do that. However, at the same time, nations across Canada now are in such a position, despite our different historical barriers and barriers we continue to face, we have built capacity in different ways. And now it's important to share those pathways, to share the knowledge, and to work together to map pathways forward. And like I said, there's no waiting with the Ring of Fire. Ontario and Canada are going to be getting in there. Look no further than the road or roads that they're looking to build. We should be leveraging our territory in some kind of negotiation with our treaty partners. We need to not sign some new agreement. We don't need to create anything brand new, but we need to somehow ensure that they are held to account to their promises. And if we continue to stand idly by and allow a road to be built, allow mines and development in our territory, we're going to be continuing to sit on the sideline. And generally that has not been by choice for some of our communities. But our communities are doing the best that they can with what they have to deal with every day. And that's why us as individuals, as a delegation, but also this is within myself as well. I need to help. I need to do whatever I can to support them as well, because they are the ones that are helping our people that are still in community, and those of us that have, for better or worse, now live outside of community need to do what they can. However they see fit, whatever creator points them toward, they need to do that, because we have very finite, short periods of time on this earth before future generations are ushered quickly in. We need to do something now. And so in the time that we're in, the demand on the critical minerals in our territory, in whatever more development that they are proposing, we need to stand firm and ensure that we are mapping out those plans forward with them. We need to be at the decision-making table at the outset, not some community to be consulted down the road when projects are already proposed. Like there's the Neil Bay mine in around Moose Creek. Like, I have no personal issue with different types of development, but there is appropriate development, and there's appropriate positioning for some of these projects. Not 11 kilometers up the river from our territory on the island or on the mainland. Not in the Ring of Fire, where it is the breathing lands of our territory that house also many generations of our burial sites and our peoples laid to rest there. We need to force government's hand with what leverage that we have. We have the land, we have our people, and what this does to non-native governments is our governance presents risk. And that is risk we have always leveraged against in negotiations, be that for impact benefit agreements or what have you. But what these bills, in the name of economic reconciliation and fast-tracking development, what they do is they eliminate time from our governance. And that eliminates risk. And what the position that we are in a weakened position in that case. So over the next while, this is what we need to do as nations. We need to focus on every front possible, not just the leadership to leadership level. Like our nations, our chiefs, our councils communicating with the federal and provincial government, that is important. That needs to continue. But there are also other avenues that we need to explore and support as well. Our grassroots youth. Nothing has ever been granted to us as people in Canada, as First Nations people, as Indigenous peoples. Nothing has been afforded to us just by gift, if not framed as a gift, and then obviously something written different back in the day. But nothing has become easy. Rights, more broadly, for First Nations people, for Indigenous peoples, for other minority groups, everybody's rights have not come without a hard-fought battle. Rights are not just afforded, they're fought for. And if we are going to fight and protect our inherent rights as peoples, if we are to fight and claim rights, human rights, that should be afforded to us as the rest of peoples around the world, especially in Canada, if they are not, then we need to fight. And so our grassroots need to mobilize on the ground. Our peoples and institutions of influence obviously need to coalition build as well. And so that is just a little bit of a framing of what our delegation is currently doing and the aspirations that we continue to carry forward as young people. We're looking to collaborate with our elders, the generations that came before us, that have the knowledge. That is all carried forward. As I said, we're not speaking, we have our own, obviously, responsibilities and whatnot, but we champion and carry forward much of the work that has already been done and continues to be done. So that's where we're at.
Well, thank you very much for that, Ryan. We're just coming to an end to our show. And for that, we'll speak more in the future. And I'd like to thank you for speaking to us on a podcast show. It's really informative, and we really appreciate your work that you do. In terms of that, and the picture we took in actually my co-worker here, he works as the communications as well. His name is Ron. He's my technician. He's the one that picked that color just to represent, to actually in respect displaying your picture, that red shirt you got on for, which is solidarity. Yeah, sorry. And for that, thank you, Ryan. And if you want to say anything before we sign off, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, thank you and miigwech for bringing me on. And anyone listening also, as I've conveyed in just this long blab period that I'm giving you all, the work is not done. There's much to be carried forward by any Indigenous person here that resides in the boundaries of what we now know as Canada, just as Mushkegowuk people as well. We hope to inspire our youth because we were a group and are a group of doers. We look at these spaces that could be taken up. Look at these things that we could do. Okay, well, how do we do them? And I hope that much of our youth also are inspired in the same way for the same causes to change the conditions and the realities as people that we face. There's much work to be done, as big or small, but I hope that our youth are able to look forward and imagine a future that is different, that is better than what much of us experience as generations that are currently living and our previous as well. Because, as I said, the generations that came before us have put in so much work. We have survived as people because of them, despite any of the challenges that they faced and any of the realities that they have had to work through on their own as people and that we continue to face. All of our peoples experience intergenerational trauma in some capacity, but we are of the first generation now that has not been explicitly touched by the 60s scoop, by the residential school system, but our generations that have been touched by those, many still are alive today, and we need to be doing this good work for them in a good way. So, miigwech.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan. Have a good day and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Wache. Okay, good to meet you, Mr. Kagi Dr. Mevadite here in the Suma. English Taga give a chim head tag to Ryan Fleming. Kitching was our watchy with time say by time you know up ahead. Our Grand Chief Mushkegowuk take a guy have an on tomorrow. With that, I spend watchy with Taggis English to run. Mushkegowuk head on middle time. Watching the Suma Shiva to make you watching the say, you go Mushkegowuk podcast.